we go. So today's agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to spend about a few minutes here at the beginning if you guys have any questions about anything class-wise, and then I'm going to do that at the end too, but excuse me. And then we're going to talk about adulthood. We're going to pick up from basically the high school age. We're going to transition into our, the 20s or college kind of age range, and then we're going to go into at least middle adulthood for sure, and talk about different aspects of that. I've got a couple of group activities for you to do as we go, and that should be it for today. So before we get into the course material, and I did put the slides on Moodle this morning. I thought I'd put them on, but I did put them on there this morning, so you can grab those, and that's what I'll be using today. You don't have to get them right now, but they're there if you want to get them anytime. So does anyone have any questions about any coursework material, which typically usually at this time of the semester usually means the paper, if anybody has any questions?
It's just to clarify something, please. So the only thing we need to do now is the report or the research, right? There is no other assignment. There is no other project. It's just the hybrid report, right?
And you have a final exam.
Yes, and of course, and the final exam. Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yep, that's it. So you only have the paper and the exam left. And the exam itself will be open next Friday. I'll open it next Friday, and it'll run through the following Wednesday, kind of just like the midterm. And it works exactly like the midterm in terms of clicking on the link and creating a username and password. You take the exam, it'll give you your grade right then. You can stop and start the exam just like the midterm. So anytime you log out, it'll save your spot. You technically have 4 hours to do it. And so that's for the exam. So any other questions about the paper?
I have a question. On the first part of the hybrid research, it says basic overview. And then on the second part is like what you learn about it. So it's like a reflection of the first part.
Yeah, so the first part of the 80% of the paper is research, right? So you're going to do, like, if you chose something in adulthood to write about, you're going to give a basic overview of whatever that part of that stage is: cognitively, socio-emotional, biologically. The reflection part is just that. What did you learn about this particular topic?
Okay, but then there's another part that is specifically for reflection. So because it's number one, number two is like numbered, but on the first part it says basic review, and then there's like a question: what do you learn about it? And then choose a disorder issue. But what I was wondering is if there's a difference between the basic review and the question, what do you learn about this stage of development? Is like in the first part, not on the second part from the reflection. So I just was wondering if it is, because kind of say the same, because in parentheses it says cognitively, emotionally, socially, physically, the same thing as basic overview, but it's kind of the same thing.
Okay.
Is it?
I mean, yeah, I guess technically
it's
similar.
Kind of like, okay.
But
because it's 20 points for the first one and 20 points for the second one. So I was just,
yeah.
maybe it's like an introduction, maybe.
I mean, the research part is like, you probably didn't know that much about it. You're writing the things that you learned. The reflection really is just a reflection. When you talk about things that you learn, you're going to reflect over the whole paper, maybe the whole semester. Right. Okay. So those are a little bit different. And maybe that's just a badly worded.
Okay.
My end.
I want to be sure.
I don't. Okay. Let me say something else about trying. try not to overthink everything on the assignments, because sometimes I do this. I'm saying this for myself too, because I overthink pretty much everything. If I'm not, I don't know if you guys have figured this out, but I'm not like a super hard grader either. Like I really want you to learn. Like if you say something, if you write something that's totally out of
Out
left
of
field,
topic.
obviously I'm gonna say something, but this is, I really want you to, the goal here is to, I wanted to be able to help you synthesize all the information, because there's so much information in this course. And so I wanted you to be able to synthesize. So
Okay,
probably, I'm more than likely, I'll just go back and look at it and probably make some changes in the wording, because it's probably just poorly worded on my part.
that's fine. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Could I say something?
Yep.
I don't think it's poorly worded at all. I think that, and this is not meant to be offensive, but at least in other classes, they have told us they expect us to be graduate level understanding of how to write a paper. And so I'm not saying, please hear me, that I'm not, I'm trying to give some constructive criticism. I think you told us clearly, it says very clearly what you want here. And I think I overthought the first time too, because then you wrote back and you said, settle down, it's okay. The first one that I had written, because I thought I needed a cover paper and a this and a that. And so I got all spun up. But really, I think this is just, it's not to reiterate everything you learned, but what does it mean to me and what are the parts, right, to pull it together. So I think there's an expectation that we are writing graduate level papers. And if we don't know that, then maybe we got to go back and learn how to write a paper. I guess that's just some of my feedback. I think you are incredibly gracious. And I really appreciate that as a teacher. I'm thankful that I took this class with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I think all of us, everybody here is at different levels of education. Like, for example, there could be some people, I don't know about this class, but I've had other classes where, you know, some people had just taken their undergraduate and kind of went into a master's degree versus some people that hadn't been in a graduate class in 20 years. I've had that, or 30 years, or what, you know, whatever it was. So we're kind of all at different levels. And so sometimes it's difficult to write directions to all the levels, or write kind of expectations for every level and how people read things or see things. And so that's why I don't mind clarifying with everyone. Just in general, my thought is always kind of, I want to try to figure out a way to help everyone, especially in a class like this, help everyone synthesize the amount of information that basically, because this class could easily be 3 semesters. We could do pretty easily do that. So I think here's where people get tripped up with the paper for the most part. It's usually not like how many pages to write or the should I have a title page and things like that. Typically, where people get tripped up, to be honest, is they spend more time on 2 things. They spend more time reflecting, which is really just kind of the back end of the paper instead of the research part. Or in the research part, they actually write the research part pretty well, but they don't put any citations, or they don't signify like the difference between what's their thought and what the research thought. And that's technically plagiarism. And I've had to send those papers back to people. So that's typically honestly, those are the big things that people kind of trip up on. And that's the reason why I started giving the APA assignment, honestly, just to like a basic, super basic citations. And so I think there's 3 parts of this paper that are hard, I think, for students. And this would be for me too. Picking a topic, that's hard because there's a lot of topics in the lifespan. If you think about it, if we talk about childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, there's like, there's like a ton of topics in there. That's the hard part. That's one. The second one is if you've never written in APA style, that's difficult. And so that's kind of a hard thing. And then the third thing is when we get to like how much is too much or how much is too little, and we don't know if we should write, 6 pages or 10 pages. And, to me, 4 to 6 pages is probably plenty. I think that'll get you exactly where you need to be. And then keeping in mind that this assignment is just one of your assignments in the class. You have other things that are helping you out. And I'm a pretty easy grader, so try not to overthink everything. But I understand overthinking because I do that too. Especially when I went back to school, I hadn't been in school in almost 20 years, so I get that part. So
class, what is it?
Anyway, okay. Any other questions about the paper?
Dr. Bedard, it's
Yeah.
Araceli,
Yeah.
the one that probably emails you way too much incessantly.
No, you're
So
fine.
I was going to say thank you again for just being a gracious professor. I can understand it's really difficult when you're taking multiple classes and you're starting up again, or if you haven't been back into college in forever. It changes, and all of us are different type of learners. So I appreciate you being a professor that sees every level, and I have learned a lot from this class. I just have a question regarding the paper. For that paper specifically, do you happen to have because I know that you've been teaching this class for a good minute. Do you happen to have examples? And obviously we will not plagiarize, but so that way we could have kind of a basis of okay, this is how a person read it. I'm following somewhat of a decent structure. I'm not going off the handrails, because I too overthink, and sometimes I overthink. And you saw one of my crazy comments once. I was talking about Tinder swindler, for crying out loud. So I could go from one to Tinder swindler on a paper. So I want to make
No,
sure
I thought that was funny. I thought that was funny. By the way, everyone's forum is really, y'all's forum discussions are really fun too. I actually do read them. I just don't always comment.
Yeah.
I probably have an example somewhere. I would have to look. I can see if I can find an example, and I'd have to get the student's permission to post it, and I can put it on Moodle.
That'd be awesome.
Let me write a note. If
And
I don't
I
write
will
this down, I will
personally-
forget, and then I won't do it. Y'all should see all the sticky notes on my monitor.
So for the overall research paper, it's just one topic that we're choosing for the entirety of it.
So it's based on the first level is the life stage or developmental stage. So again, for example, if I say I'm going to talk about adulthood, and then the second level is kind of like, is there a disorder or a issue or a situation? It could be, if we're talking about adulthood, it could be anxiety or depression in adulthood. It could be work change, like a transition. Like right now, 40% of the workforce has flipped over. It could be something like that. It could be in adolescence. It could be like in adolescence, you got a wide variety of things, anxiety, depression, eating disorder, self-harm.
Okay. I can see that now.
Yeah.
How it's laid out. Okay.
Yeah. And then that's the research part. You're going to, whatever that disorder or that issue is, really what you're researching. Because on the back end, you also want to say, here's some treatment options for whatever that issue or that disorder is. In other words, if you were going to be the clinician working with this person that had this particular disorder or issue, what are some treatment options, or how would you work with that person, basically?
Okay.
And I have had so many different kinds of topics, like all kinds of topics. And mainly, there's almost no topic that's out of bounds, really. It really depends on the amount of research you can find for that particular topic or that disorder or that issue. Because if you pick something that's super specific, but doesn't have a lot of research behind it, it's going to be hard to write the paper because you just won't find enough research on that particular topic. Versus, when we talk about mental health, just in general, like pretty much every developmental, every stage along the lifespan, you can more than likely find something about mental health, depression or anxiety or self-harm. Even in childhood, you can find plenty of information. Versus if you start getting a little more, you know, a little more specific or a little more narrowed in your focus, you might find a little bit less research. But the key is, to me, it's just finding things that you're, you know, especially something you're passionate about. Like if you really are passionate about a specific lifespan developmental stage and a specific disorder or issue, that's what I would say. You know, go for that, because the only downside there is you get into a rabbit hole and you just start researching and researching and researching. You don't write. That's the hard part, because you can find, once you start finding articles, if you're like me, I find one that leads me to another one that leads me to another one. All of a sudden I've got 10 articles and I've spent an hour not doing anything. That happens too. You kind of have to be careful. That's way too much of an answer, I'm sure.
It answered my question though, but
Yeah.
I know that I asked this for the other papers that we've done, so I just want to be sure that this one is no different. But are you wanting us to have I know it says APA format, are you wanting us to continue having the numbered bullets in there, or have it just truly paper APA style?
Yeah, it's a paper. The other
Okay.
assignments have been, you could have done like short essay even, or like the other
Mhm.
exercises that we've done. It's a little different. For full on research paper, you're always going to write it in, you know, paragraph form in like a paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to just double check on
Yeah.
that one. Thank
And
you.
and I'd also want to make sure it really does help when you have headings to organize your paper. That helps a lot too. And just an FYI, what I usually do for like developing a template for a paper, what I usually would do was start at the beginning, like your introduction, right? Put introduction, and then come down. If I kind of knew what my headings were going to be, like if I kind of knew the sections of my paper, which you can kind of think through, and you can always change it. I would go ahead and put those headings on my paper and leave space to fill in. That's kind of what I do. Because if I don't do that, like to me, that's how I organize things. Not everyone does it that way. You don't have to do it that way. That's just one way to kind of think through it. And that way you also get like those headings represent the information, right, that you're putting into the paper. That way you don't forget anything. So you make sure you get all of those headings in there first, and then you're just kind of filling in the information, if that makes sense. And then typically I would start by, I probably should have told you all this like 8 weeks ago. I typically also start with my reference page, and I go ahead and write, like I go ahead and start creating the reference list of things I'm going to use, like the information I'm going to use. I go ahead and put it in there first and have that page, on my paper, like as part of the paper, so I can quickly look and make sure that I'm following that. I learned that through just trial and error writing papers. Like I said, when I came back to school, I hadn't written a paper in forever. So that's just how I'd been teaching classes for a long time, and that's how I taught my classes. I kind of organized it like in an outline form and then just wrote the paper that way. So you can do it that way too. That's how I do it. Not everyone does it the same. You guys do it whatever works for you.
I have a
It's way
different
too much
question.
information, but go ahead. Yep.
You gave some awesome handouts, and one of them, for instance, is, it kind of looks, it says Amberton at the top. It says lifespan development, and then it has every lifespan development, adolescent, beginning, all the way, right? And
Yep.
so if I'm going to pull something out of endings and I want to quote you, then
That's from the book.
all
All that's from the book. I just kind of like I
But
just,
could I use you as a reference, or do I have to now cite you having cited the book?
just cite the book.
Okay,
That came from the book.
I love it, and it's
yeah.
very handy, and I was just gonna, okay, and so now a different question. You know how you were explaining to somebody else about what treatment option we would use?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that if we're, thinking just as a whole and the different classes we've been taking, is it okay to use a different course where we learned one of the therapies, whether it's CBT or choice or,
Yeah, absolutely.
okay, thank you.
I would.
Well, I don't know how else to answer
Yeah, that
what
would.
treatment I would use other than dipping into those other classes.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So if you're a first-time student and you have never taken another class, right, you're going to answer that differently than the way Donna might be saying. Because if you've had 3 or 4 classes and you've already started talking about theories and techniques, let's say, then you kind of have a leg up, because you can go, well, I think I would use CBT in this instance, and you can write about that, right? Versus if you haven't ever class before, and you have no idea what, like when I first came back to school, they kept throwing this word around, intervention. And in my mind, I'm like thinking of the TV show Intervention. That's not what that means, though. An intervention is the technique or part of the model, the technique from the model you would use to help someone to help intervene in whatever's going on. It's basically how you would help them, right? So if I use CBT and they have a cognitive distortion, I reframe that distortion. Yeah, that's an intervention, for example. But if you've never had a class before and this is your first one, you're going to have to rely on the research to say, how do you, for example, if I have a client that has depression, you can literally go into EBSCO and talk and say, depression, treatment for depression or something like that, whatever, intervention for depression. And you'll get a bazillion, answers to that. And you can just pick one, whatever treatment option you would use. In general, CBT is probably the reason why it comes up the most, is because it's the most researched. It's been, and the evidence-based research around it's been going for decades. But there's other things you can use for different types of issues or disorders. And so that's why I kind of left that a little bit open-ended to a certain extent. But I would highly suggest, if you have already had some classes and you're like, well, hey, I kind of like this CBT model, or I kind of like looking at this from an existential standpoint, whatever, I would say use that. Just making sure that you're obviously citing, whatever it is that you're using. Because obviously we didn't come up with that model or those techniques. We're just citing those things. Donna, does that help?
It certainly does. And then also to maybe help anybody else who might be, I don't know if you remember that on the information that you gave, after every lifespan area, you give, well, almost all of them, you give places that we can go to find more information, like on crisis, grief, and healing, because mine's in an older age and it has to do with that. But there's hospice information. So you gave other websites on here. If people haven't looked at this is like really good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of that information would be also pretty helpful when you guys start studying for your licensing exam too. So I got that. That is a combination between Dr. Latson was the professor that taught this class mostly before me. And then when I came in, she had created those and I took them and kind of rearranged some things and added some things. So part of that's hers. And I think she got it from someone else. So it's kind of like this accumulation of several people, but it's all coming from the textbook. And those websites they should be current, hopefully. I try to make sure that they are. Sometimes those websites change every once in a while, and I've had to change a couple, but they should be current. Okay.
Just last question. So
Yeah.
we can use the textbook itself as a resource, as
Yep.
well as at least 3 other articles, or
That's correct.
Thank you so much.
That's correct. Yeah, you can use the textbook, and then you'll just need 3 other outside sources. Yeah, that's right. So you'll You'll have a minimum of 4 sources for sure. You can have more than that if you want, but you'll have a minimum of 4. And the book can be one of them. That's right.
Thank you so much.
Donna, you put on here RGS 6035. Is that the research class?
Yeah, and if yes, I'm gonna hold up something because it's really that was Dr. Oh gosh. He used to be a pastor. He lives out in the country. I could tell you about his wife and everybody, but I'm trying to remember. I want to say it's Armstrong, but this little card, if you don't have this for whatever your field is, it is at the top. And I looked across the different cards. It's on the stand in Frisco, but that RGS 6035 class, it's theory and applications of research methods.
Yeah.
This, if I didn't take this, I think I might be in the same boat of like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure how to do this. And I think that's the way they put it as the #1 thing.
Yeah.
And he also told us they tried to get it moved up to the top because students were struggling with the papers. And by putting this up in the front, it helps. So I think it might have been a fluke that I stumbled upon it and I knew to take that class first. It's not easy, but it is well worth your time.
Yeah, I think for the most part, we try really, really hard. I say we, Amerton as a whole, we try really, really hard to steer
Let me grab some.
towards that class for everyone, just because it is really helpful, especially if you haven't been in school for a long time. So that can be super helpful. So
I totally agree with you guys. That class was the first class the advisor recommended. And yes, indeed, I think is the best choice to take it in the very beginning because that will build all other skills. So I agree with you, Donna.
yeah,
The research class was amazing.
It was
Very hard though.
It was Dr. Schultz.
Oh yeah, I took Dr. Schultz.
Dr. Jonathan Schultz.
Oh, yeah, he's awesome.
Was who taught it.
Yeah.
He's awesome.
Yeah.
And
He's
but, you know,
tough.
anyway, and you know what? Putting our things into binders, marriage and family doctor told us to do this because you will need, when you're studying for your exam, to be able to find the information for all the different courses that we've taken.
So that was Dr. Hubbard, right?
Dr. Hubbard is marriage and family. And he said, folks, I know this sounds very
old-fashioned and weird.
Old-fashioned, but look, I can go pull it. I know who Dr. Schultz was in which class and all the information. I have the same thing for yours. And it just makes life easier to be organized like that.
I still have all my binders from all the classes that are done.
Yeah.
Because it is weird and old school kind of, because now we can do it electronically, but it's helpful. Okay, let's take a step back from our questions for a second. I am going to stick around at the very end to answer questions if you have more. So I will do that. Sorry, my dog's about to bark. Okay, good. He barks at nothing. There's nothing out there, but he just starts barking randomly. So here's where we're going to go. Great questions. And I like the chat. You guys keep chatting away. Here's what I want to do today. I want to start with a quick discussion in some groups. And this is a super easy discussion. It's not like brain teaser or anything in the morning. Here's a discussion question, because we're making a transition now from this adolescent world into the adult world, and we're going to kind of probably hurriedly work through the young adult parts and get into the middle adulthood, especially, mainly because for the most part that's the age group that most clinicians work with for the most part. Not that those other life stages are not important, but we're going to kind of make some transition into that. So my question for everyone is kind of like an icebreaker, fun kind of question. There's 2 questions. The first one's super fun. Since we had May 4th this week, I always ask a Star Wars question. So as part of the icebreaker in your group, I just want you to tell each other who your favorite Star Wars character is or was and why. And if you've never seen Star Wars, I'm so sorry that you've never seen it. You can just, look it up or something. I don't know. I don't even know what to tell you if you've never seen any if you don't know what Star Wars is, that'd be pretty tough because it's been around since I went to the first one in 1977. I was 6 years old and I saw it in the movie theater like 3 times. So that's the first question. The second question is there an amount of money that would help you or make you want to go back into high school again? All right, so those are your 2 questions. Super easy, super fun, keep it light. And I'm going to put you guys into rooms. There's not a whole lot of us today, so we'll keep the rooms. There we go. All right. Have fun. All right. How many people did we cut off? That's always my favorite thing when I'm in a group like this. I've done a bunch of seminars with like 400 people, and every once in a while they do of course those rooms are like 30 people in a room, and everyone's talking, then all of a sudden it's like over. You go back to the main room and someone's in the mid-sentence. Kind of funny. Okay, so how much money did we get up to for you to go back to high school? I'm always curious.
I think in ours, we had somebody say $50,000.
That's all?
That was then we had another one say there is no amount of money that would make them go back. None.
That's me. Check.
And I said I would go back for no money. I mean, my high school years were great. I mean, it was
good.
It was great. Yeah.
Good for you. Well, yeah, it doesn't mean it's horrible. It's just a fun question. But yeah, some people loved high school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Would your answer change if I said junior high? Some people say yes, some people say no.
I love
Yes.
I loved high school. And I really love listening to Jenny. I think you're really awesome that you didn't get drifted off with all of the other things. Potentially, I mean, you seem like a really strong girl, and so it was really neat to hear your story. Just how you were in the group, and you worked so hard too, in your classes and whatnot, and did soccer and did the cheerleading and everything. So that was really awesome. I think that helps keep us out of trouble. But I wouldn't. Even though I loved high school and it was a lot of fun for me, I wouldn't go back because of where I am now and what I know now. Life is way easier now than back then.
Mhm.
Just there's so much going on. So no money here.
I mean, I'll be honest, if someone said I'll give you $1 billion, I'm like, okay, well that's yeah, I probably would do it. Now, if you knew all the information you know now, and you could take that information back, like in a movie, right? We're in a movie and we're our age now, and we wake up tomorrow and we're back in 10th grade, but we're ourselves now, like a movie, like they do Freaky Friday or whatever, one of those ones. Yeah, that's a little different. Maybe, because then
that's what Rosa said. Rosa, she said, well, if I could tell them what you said.
I mean, first, if I can go back knowing what I know now, I will go back like happily.
Yeah.
And if they give me like $5 million, yeah, I will go back again. So then they told me like, yeah, well, you will be homeschooling. You don't have to go to high school then.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why I asked this question is because one of the big differences between adolescence as we get into adulthood, in my opinion, as I've worked with people and just studied people for a long time, one of the big differences is the amount of wisdom that you have, right? As you get older, and I'm not trying to bring up this idea of wisdom as I'm like some crotchety old guy that has wisdom on top of a mountain that you go to get. That's not what I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about experience that you have and mostly mistakes that you've made, right? So we all make mistakes that can really hinder us or hinder our growth or stunt our growth, or we can make mistakes and go, dang, I wish I wouldn't have done that. What would I do different, or how did I learn from that, or whatever? It doesn't mean you didn't make the mistake, but it's a mindset that you can have. And I'm bringing this up because when you're working with people, it's very important that we realize that they're going to be coming to you having made a mistake or wanting to change something or not liking, whatever situation is going on, even if they have depression or anxiety or, you know, whatever is going on for them. We all are on this kind of search for something. Wisdom is one of those things. And if you read, and we won't get into too far into this today because of time, but as we get older, there's also this idea that we really are searching for meaning more and more in our life or in a situation. So sometimes people come to you because they just can't quite make sense of the meaning of something, whether it's trauma or grief or I didn't get this job. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people could be coming to you for. And so when we think about, hey, if I had all this information that I have now, which means all the mistakes I've made in the past that I've learned from, you know, all the decisions that I made that I wish I wouldn't have made, or the decisions I made that were good decisions, I could take all that back with me and have a do-over. We might do it because we kind of have a lot of information. We could also, you know, have all the lottery numbers, and win the lottery and whatever. So I wanted to have that little bitty mini discussion because it really becomes important to me as clinicians that we start thinking about like how we help our clients, and how we construct the case to help our clients figure out whatever they're trying to figure out. Because sometimes people come and they kind of know what they want already. They have some goals set in their mind, pretty clear goals. Those clients are great because then you're like, oh, then we can just go. Sometimes they come and they're like, I don't know what's going on. Something's going on. I don't know what it is, which we're going to talk about some of that today with this adulthood discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with, let me get over here, get my slides ready. There we go. I want to make it big enough so we can see it. Okay. Let's move this guy out of the way. I'm hoping everyone can see this. If you cannot see it, just let me know. I'll try to make it big enough so you can see it. Okay. So I wish we had time to focus on like every aspect of every developmental stage, but we just don't. So I'm going to focus in on a few things. Personality being one of them. I'm also going to focus a little bit on the socio-emotional pieces. We're going to talk about cognitions too as we age, like memory, personality, memory, intelligence, those kinds of things. We're going to talk about some of those things too. I'm also going to talk a little bit about relationships, like how relationships form or what it looks like as we move into the various life stages, especially as we come out of adolescence. We talked a lot about the brain last time that we met. This idea of personality is it's not the old school way of thinking of personality was, the old psychological principles were that you had your personality locked in by age 3, 4, 5, something like that. And as we've studied and learned more about the brain, that's not necessarily the case. It is pretty locked in certain ways, but there's parts of the personality that can change because we're learning that there's different parts of personality. We talked a little bit about pruning last time with adolescence. That pruning part is also part of personality formation, including things like temperament, right? Which is a big part of our life. Like we can actually work on our temperament, right? We're finding that we have more and more control over that. We have more and more control over our attitude. We have more and more control over like our thoughts than we thought we did. We thought there used to be this kind of prevailing thought that personality meant you actually thought a certain way, your temperament was a certain way, and that was it. And like in my family, there's definitely people in my family where it was like, oh, that's just Uncle blah, blah, blah. That's just how he is or whatever, right? Bless his heart. Like in my family, that's kind of like how things were. What we know now is like, if you don't want to have that temperament, you don't have to. Now you have to work on it, but if you don't want it, you don't have to. The thing is, it's easier to work on it when you're younger than it is when you're older, right? Because you're pruning things away and you're growing other synaptic connections that may make it harder later, especially when our environment is in a certain, if we live in a certain type of environment, not just necessarily our physical environment, but our emotional and mental environment. In other words, if you live in a really traumatic situation, that's going to really have a big impact on what you prune and what you don't. Same thing with if you live in a lower socioeconomic status, that's going to have a big impact on that. For example, I'm working with some clients, just started working with them super recently, and they actually are what I would say probably in the upper part of socioeconomic status, but they grew up in the super lower part, like super poor. And matter of fact, the wife, her father was probably a binge drinking alcoholic, but just functional enough that he could provide kind of a baseline for them. But there was several kids, and so they kind of lived close to poverty most of her life. And so she basically, and we just talked about this recently. She just basically decided sometime in high school that she did not like being poor, basically. So she became a dentist. She's got her own practice. She's grown the practice. I mean, she's like super high achiever, which is awesome. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's causing her some problems now as we've started to uncover some reasons why that is for her, and it's really started to have a negative impact on her parenting and her marriage and things like that. Her husband actually came from the exact opposite, where he had super high income, and when he was kind of growing up, he kind of was like, oh, whatever. He didn't really exert himself at all. So you've got a super high charging type A and someone that's like, it's okay. Well, that's like oil and water when it comes to career, money, parenting, right? So all these things are starting to bubble up. Some of that stuff starts happening when we make this transition from adolescence into adulthood. Some of that, because some of that's based on environment. Okay. I got this graphic from Dr. Armstrong. I just think it's really funny. So when we're young, we have a ton of time and energy, but hardly any money at all. When we're old, we have a lot of time and money and not very much energy. In the middle is adulthood, where we have not much time, ton of money, a ton of energy. I don't know about the money part. My kids take up pretty much all of that for me, but I definitely have a lot more money than when I was, when I was a teenager, right? The energy part, that's iffy. That's a little iffy, but this is pretty accurate in a lot of ways. So I just always thought this was a little bit interesting that they all three don't necessarily all, add up to each other. I think that one of the big things as a parent is that your kids basically look at you as having a full money bar all the time, right? Like there's literally a tree in your closet that you nurture and grow and money comes from. Like $100 bills just sprout off of it all the time, which is, there's one of my kids, I won't say who, it could be my daughter, but I'm not sure. She just thinks that, if I go on Amazon and I make a Amazon list, that she should just be able to order all that stuff whenever she wants. No big deal. It's $300. That's okay. We got a tree in our closet that has money on it. We just get it, right? But we learn, right, as we get older, that that's not how it works, right? You have to actually work for it and do something for it. So we are going to talk about the transition. I am going to talk a little bit more about the career and work areas. And so when we talk about adolescence to adulthood, this term emerging adulthood has been around for a while now. Young adulthood, emerging adulthood, late adolescence. I've heard all those kind of used. You guys might have heard of other ones. So it's that 18 to 25-year-old range. Probably 18 to 27 is probably a little more accurate. So by the time you get to the end of that, the tail end of that, then you're talking about fully formed brains, including the prefrontal cortex. And so you have a lot of those folks are able to make better decisions, probably because they have a little bit better understanding of how the world works, but also their brain is formed in a way that's super helpful. It doesn't mean that an 18-year-old can't make good decisions, because they can. 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds can make great decisions too. And it doesn't mean that 40-year-olds make great decisions all the time, right? We can make anyone can make a bad decision. It just means you have the tools that you need at your fingertips a little bit more at 25 or 6 than you did at 18. That's all. Okay. So there's a lot of identity exploration, because remember we talked about this last time with adolescence. Identity is huge. We really start to decide like who we are, what we believe. Do we like what we are? Do we like what we believe? That really carries over into young adulthood. There's a lot of self-focus, and there's a lot of possibility in your 20s. Like you don't think about it necessarily that way always, but there's just a lot of possibilities that you have. And then when you start thinking about, I'm holding a job down, I'm getting a little bit more economic independence in my 20s, especially towards the tail end of that, might be having my first full-time job with benefits, and I can kind of be on my own, away from mom and dad, or away from my caregiver. And then this idea of like how we define adulthood, which we're going to come back to in a second, you start to really kind of get into this world of like, okay, if I'm 20, 21, and I'm in college, I'm still an adult, technically, legally, but I might not be financially independent yet. Versus some kids graduate high school, maybe do a trade school, or just get a job, and they become financially dependent. And so age-wise, they're technically legal and adult, and they have some financial independence. And then there's a mixture of all of those things. There's actually some studies that are coming out now about the amount of students in America that are not going to college, and that number is actually growing. Some of it started growing during COVID, and so I don't know that it'll be a long-term trend necessarily, but that is happening, and there's actually a lot more folks coming out of high school and doing like a trade school kind of thing. That's happening. And especially in rural areas, like in Texas, especially, a lot of rural area schools are investing heavily into technical training facilities at their high schools, which I think is I think it's smart. There's 30 to 40 million blue collar or trade type jobs that are missing in America right now that are pretty good jobs. Like that's your welding and plumbing, electrical, carpentry, that type thing. Those are great jobs to have, and they're great trades and skills to have. But the world of the kind of the college world, or has been so heavily pushed on students for so long, it's kind of hard for students to think, oh, I need to go to college versus, man, I can do this trade school and it's just as good. So there's a little bit of a push and pull there sometimes. Okay.
I have a really quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So remember how you were just talking about some people, even though the brain is like almost fully developed at 25, and then you were saying how obviously people who are 40 aren't as mature as some, who are still in high school and whatnot. And I was just literally thinking back to the breakout with Jenny, and she amazingly, it sounds in the short time that I heard her speaking, like she was on track, and she seemed to have a more developed brain, in my opinion, than other kids that can spin out of control. Is some of that because of the influence, do you think, of like her parents? What do you find with your clients? Because she, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jenny, but it sounded like your parents were also very involved in your life and very present for you.
Yes, I also had strict parents too. So I had a lot of friends, but I really couldn't hang out with them. And I had to be home really early. The latest was like 10 p.m. And my mom, she was very strict about me dating. And all my friends were pregnant. I was the only, up to this day, I still don't have any kids. All my friends have up to like 3, 4 kids now. And throughout high school, everybody's like, oh, Jenny's going to get pregnant. No. Because I was scared of my mom telling me, once you get pregnant, your life is over. Your life is over. And I didn't want, I was in so many activities and I didn't want to have to ruin, all of that.
Okay, so I hear what you're saying, because I had strict parents like that too.
Yeah.
However, as you and I know, life isn't over because you have a baby,
Yeah.
right? But it can make it a lot harder, right? But
Yeah.
and so I understand like your mom's philosophy. But back to Dr. Bedard, do you see that some children whose the mind is developing more responsibly in some ways, or contributing to society, trying to make something better of their life, do you find it's because the parents were really, really involved or not? I mean, what is your experience with your clients?
So there's probably 20 variables involved in what you're asking, I would say.
Okay.
So
not an easy answer.
yeah. I think what I hear Jenny say is like, what I'm hearing from some discussions you guys are having is like, for this example, Jenny's parents sound like they were involved, but it was more like, hey, this is a pretty rigid structure we're going to put in place around you, or a pretty rigid boundary, and you have to follow that boundary in that structure. And there's not really there's not a lot of flexibility inside of that boundary. That's kind of what I'm hearing. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that's just how you lived. I mean, that was just your experience versus, I'm going to pick on Sarah. This is probably not true, but Sarah could have had parents with the exact opposite, right? Here's a boundary and a structure, but it's pretty pliable. It's more like a chain link fence with a bunch of gates around it. You can, if you want to come home at 10, that's awesome. But if you want to come home at 12, that's fine. Just let us know. Right. And Sarah and Jenny could have had the exact same type of life and made the same exact decisions, basically, and had the same outcomes. Basically, it doesn't mean, though, the other thing that's happening is their brains are probably developing in very similar ways. Now, I think we only have one other guy besides me on this call. But if I was talking about a guy, we know for sure that male and female brains develop at different speeds too. We know that. It's not bad or good. It just is. And we know that environment plays a large role in all of these things. So environment can be your culture, ethnicity, or race. It could be your socioeconomic status. It could be whatever kind of school, like in this, we've talked about high school or college, like what type of, education you got or didn't get, a parenting or caregiving. It could be trauma. We haven't talked about trauma hardly at all. Like, what role does trauma play, or what role does any kind of abuse play? Like there's like all these variables, right, that kind of come into play. And so as we talk about what's happening for most people coming out of adolescence, the numbers are still pretty low when it comes to like traumatic experiences. Not 100% of people have traumatic experiences necessarily, but the ones that do, we know that they are can be extremely difficult to overcome for people, right? So when we think about young adulthood, and especially as we get into our 20s, because now we're kind of really making a transition from our 20s, kind of getting into our 30s. There's also just some practical things that are happening. I'm trying to kind of get to it over here.
Thank you. I didn't mean to take you off track.
No,
I was just
fine.
curious.
You're fine.
And it's way bigger than just that.
Yeah,
she was just very smart in a lot of her choices.
And it sounds like she didn't have some choices she didn't have because they were made for her versus some choices she can make on her own. And that works for some people. Again, this isn't bad or good, right? This isn't like, here's how you need to do it. Remember, we talked about different types of parenting styles, right? Well, parenting doesn't stop when you go to college. You keep It keeps happening. But when we start thinking about things clinically, we need to start thinking about all of these variables, because all of the variables could have an impact on where we're at right now. And now I'm going to throw everything on its ear, and y'all take it for what it's worth. This is definitely a rabbit trail. Okay. So now I'm totally off script here. I'm an attachment theorist. So I automatically also look at a lot of childhood things and a lot of attachment style kinds of conversations and how our emotions play a role in that or don't. So I do that just as that's kind of what that's kind of how I do it. Not everyone does it that way. If you're not really an attachment theory person, if you're more along the lines of, oh man, there's so many. I mean, you could look at it so many different ways. You might not look at it that way, and it also depends on what, in terms of our clients, what they're looking for. Let me skip to something. A lot of this stuff you guys can look up, and it's kind of interesting to look at. I do want to camp out here for a second when we start talking about substance abuse, alcohol or substances. The amount of alcohol consumption in teenagers has been going down steadily. I think we talked about this last time. Cigarette smoking for sure has been going down. Vaping's been going up. Marijuana use has always kind of been on a positive trend. But when we get into the 20s, that's where we get into things like binge drinking, especially if you go to college. When I taught at Texas Tech, I used to give this kind of I used to give a brief binge drinking assessment to college to my classes. So binge drinking is technically like 5+ drinks at one time, at least one time over the last 2 weeks. So in college, that's like, a Friday, Saturday is a lot of times when it happens. Now it can happen outside of college too, but it increases in that age group, especially in college, depending on how you view that. And so a lot of times when you start drinking that way in college, experimentation super, super, super normal. And a lot of students will stop experimenting somewhere through college and get into their first job, and they're fine. They don't heavily drink anymore. A lot of them do that, but there's 30 or 40% that might not do that. And they might continue to do that behavior, and they might have low level drink. Right. And then every time a stress comes, that level increases. That happens too. Substance abuse is often very much the same way. It's very much a self-medicating type of thing that happens. And so it is important to kind of know about these things. And again, I'm hitting these things at a really high level. You have classes that'll kind of dive into this a little bit more. Same thing is true of cigarette smoking. Even though cigarette smoking is going down, vaping is going up. The amount of vaping is going up. And the addiction to nicotine is one of the strongest addictions, other than heroin and meth, that I know of. Nicotine is extremely addictive and really difficult to break, for sure. I want to look, there's a couple of things. Let's talk a little bit about I do want to talk a little bit about attachment, because attachment started out as the way it started was basically looking at how, if a child did not attach itself, especially emotionally, to a caregiver, they would have trouble later on in their life. That's kind of how it started. Now it's morphed into a much bigger, more widely used, more universal theory. And so attachment style, like these would be 3 of them. And you can read about this in the book. There's actually several different there's actually several different assessments you can take about your particular attachment style. You can look at when you, if you were going to work with marriages and families, especially marriages. Like for me, this is why attachment style was so important to me, because I look at how the couple will, like you have an adult attachment style, like how adults are attaching with each other. In other words, is their marriage, you know, a secure place? Like, is it a safe place? So in other words, like one example, like this is the example I give a lot of my clients. Like if you remember childhood and you played chase or tag and you're kind of running and it's kind of fun, and someone gets close to you, you run a little bit faster, but you're just trying to get to base, whatever that base is. And once you get to base, then they can tag you, but you'll never be it. You'll always be safe from being it. And adults aren't necessarily that much different. Like we don't want to run and chase after our loved ones, and we don't want to have them chase after us. We want our marriage or our relationship to be base. We want it to be the safe spot where we can have safe discussions, even if they're difficult, and fun discussions or whatever it is. We want that to be a secure, safe spot. And a lot of times what's happened is we have these markers of emotional kind of breaks or traumas or injuries that happen. And they could be small. They don't have to all be huge, but they could be small, but there could be enough of them over years that all of a sudden that what should be safe and secure becomes less so. Doesn't mean that we don't get, I've worked with plenty of couples that have been married for, 2-3 decades, but the last 10 years were kind of like they were roommates and just kind of hanging out because they didn't really feel safe. And every time they try to have those conversations, the other one just kind of gets defensive or whatever. And so when we think about attachment style, there's two things that are important. The first thing is everyone has one. Everybody has an attachment style. The second thing is if you don't like yours, unless you're secure, you can work on your attachment style. It's not like set in stone and this is the way it is forever. You can work on your attachment style. It does help if the other person that you're with works on it too. That helps a lot, right? So they have to kind of become more secure. And so that's just an overarching kind of, like, I don't know if y'all can see, but where my finger point, like this whole shelf of books is all attachment kind of stuff on it. So there's tons of information about attachment style. When we start talking about intimacy, and now we're transitioning from really that late 20s all the way into our 40s and 50s. If we kind of look at that law, that's a pretty big range of folks. We start talking about intimacy and attraction and love and close relationships, not just our friendships, but it could be romantic relationships. Especially now, a lot of the research coming out is telling us a couple of things about the late 20s. People are getting married on the average later in life. When I say later in life, I mean in the later 20s, 26 or 27 for females and 27, 28 for males on average. This isn't, some people do it before that, some people do it after, and we're talking about first marriages. We also know that on the whole, on the average of a first birth is getting later in life, being pushed into the late 20s. They probably have something to do with each other. I don't think it's causation, but there's a correlation there. Okay. The idea that there's a 50% divorce rate is a little bit deceiving, a little bit. It's usually 50% of a given number of people year over year. So it might be that 50% of new marriages potentially, but not 50% of all marriages in that given year. It's kind of how you should look at that a little bit. But the number's still in the high 40s in terms of divorce. But also there are now starting to be less and less marriages too. We're going to talk about all these things as we go through. So now we start really transitioning from, we've gone from high school into the college years or a technical training or I get a first job or whatever it is. I started to find someone that I love, I connect with, I get married or I live with or whatever's happening. That's where we're starting to transition. And then we get into our 30s and all of a sudden things are starting to change a lot, we don't think about it that way. That's just happening, right? Like you don't think about, oh my gosh, I'm getting older and I'm less, I can do this or I can't do that. We don't necessarily think about those things, but those things are happening with us. So when we start thinking about this idea of being independent or autonomous, that's this time frame, especially the mid 20s into the mid 30s, that autonomy of your life and your identity typically should be formed, or probably is formed by then, for the most part. There could be some variables at play that maybe hinder some of that formation, but for the most part, you're on your own financially. Mostly you're independent, you kind of make your own decisions. That's pretty much the things that are happening. Then if you add in, then we start really adding into the mix the fact that besides our friendships, we might have romantic relationships if we didn't have them already, right? So there's this this is all in the book, and there's a lot of, I use this a lot for just kind of basic information, even with my clients. Hang on, when we start talking about kind of what love is made up of, love is not the idea of love has been romanticized in a lot of ways, but it's really made up of some components, and it doesn't just happen necessarily overnight. And love at first sight is not necessarily a thing per se. It's more of a chemical reaction that can happen. But the way that love is built in the long run is through 2 or 3 different variables. The overarching variables are intimacy, commitment, and passion, right? So, and I want to make a distinction between intimacy and passion because they're a little bit different. Commitment kind of makes sense to most people. Like you're making a commitment like, hey, this is my person. I'm your person, you're mine. And we're, it's kind of like, this is it. I'm committing to you, period. And I'm trusting and all those things, right? All the trust and the responsibility and the provision, all those things is part of commitment. Intimacy is a little different. Intimacy is not necessarily made up of like sexual intimacy. Intimacy is being able to be vulnerable with that person, be open with that person, but also being able to share goals and dreams and ideas and sharing life, even when things are difficult. That's intimacy. Passion is a little bit more of that, the lust that we feel, a little more along the lines of sexual touch and kind of your sexual connection that you have. You can have different types of this where you have a high passion and low intimacy and low commitment. That's a lot of infatuation, right? So you can look at all of these in affectionate loves where you have a lot of intimacy, a lot of commitment. Those are both high, but your passion's really low. That's affectionate love. And all couples probably go through various stages of all of these things along the way, right? Consummate love is when you kind of have an equal portion of all 3 of these kind of working together. This is just one way to look at kind of the overarching themes of love. I do want to talk about some of this. Is cohabitation, it's in and of itself has been rising for a long time. There's less and less people choosing to get married. Now that's probably also geographic. We're talking about the country as a whole on average, not just in Texas or in the South or in the North or whatever. We're talking about on a whole. And that's especially true of people that are, let's say they've gone through a divorce and they meet someone. They might move in together first before they get married. That happens quite often with people. A lot of times people want to do that because they kind of want to see if the marriage thing is going to work. They want to live with someone first. They want to share expenses or, spend, more focused time together. We do know that along the way, longitudinally speaking, people that cohabitate, it doesn't mean that their divorce rate's lower. It's actually about the same, and their actual marital satisfaction is lower on the whole, longitudinally speaking. Excuse me. But we also know a couple of other things that when you get into a cohabitating relationship, this is kind of a hypothesis. One of the reasons why some of their satisfaction is lower is because maybe they have a little bit lower commitment rate to a long-term relationship, potentially. That's not a causation, that's just a correlation. That this type of like cohabitation has been trending upwards for a while, even before COVID. COVID's probably added to that a little bit, but that's just something that's been happening. Some of these are, I'm going to skip through some of these. There are some benefits of a good healthy marriage, and not every marriage is perfect. There's no such thing. And good marriages do take, I think it takes targeted work and energy. But we know that happily married people tend to live longer and have a little bit healthier lives on the whole, on the average. They do actually feel less physical and emotional distress on the average. If you think about it, one of the biggest most distressing variables in someone's life is like if their relationship is going bad or if something's wrong or rocky in the relationship. That's a super stressful thing for people. And then if you throw in other stressors on top of that, it almost makes everything more magnified. And so we know that if you have a pretty good marriage, and now good marriage can be defined in multiple ways, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that here in a second. But when we talk about remarriage, a lot of times remarriage happens fairly quickly, especially for men. Men tend to remarry quicker than women do when it comes to remarriage. Probably one of the reasons is because ex-wives are more hesitant to introduce their kids to someone new than husband or ex-husbands are. That's probably one variable. There's lots of ways to look at that. And doesn't mean that only men do it quicker. Sometimes women do it quicker. It probably depends on the situation. This particular slide, I'm going to camp out here for a second. So now we're talking again, if we kind of look at the trends and say late 20s, and we're running this into the early 50s, let's say, and because you've gotten your job, you've probably gotten married, probably had a child by then, that kind of thing. You might have changed jobs. All those things have happened. So if we look at marriage inside of that kind of middle adulthood area, especially, we know a few things about what makes marriages work. And so John Gottman and his wife Julie have been doing work in marital satisfaction, marriage, conflict, for decades. And he's probably, I would think he's probably researched the concept and principles of marriage more than anybody. And he and his team have come up with these principles of making marriage work, and have written about it multiple times. There's lots of books now, lots of articles. But these 7 principles of making a marriage work, you can actually get trained in this. You can become a Gottman level type therapist and work with marriages. They've been shown through research to work. His kind of claim to fame when he first kind of came on the scene was that he could tell within the first 15 minutes of a conversation if a couple was headed toward divorce or not, just by looking at 4 different thing. We're going to talk about these four. He calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. If he sees 1, 2, 3, 4 of those, he could tell if someone's heading for divorce or not. But in order to stay away from that, some of these principles are really important. So how we love each other is important. And so that includes like how I feel love, express love, parts of our relationship history, like kind of what attracted us to begin with, nurturing fondness and admiration, turning towards each other, even during conflict instead of away, even if that's emotionally, especially if that's emotionally, receiving influence from your partner, which is a huge one, especially if they're really going through a really hard time, solving solvable conflicts versus there's some conflicts that you might not ever solve over the history of your relationship, but there's a whole lot of conflicts that you should be able to solve together. Gridlock is where we feel like we're stuck and we can't make decisions, we can't solve something. Being able to overcome that by also turning toward each other. And then this idea of creating shared meaning is basically like getting on the same page in terms of like direction and what we feel like is important and things that we feel like are necessary and valuable to us or our family. And so, and there's lots of different types of interventions that they show you how to use to kind of build this framework into a relationship. I don't know if I've got anything. Hang on just one second. So one of the things that he talks about when it comes to relationships is there's four, like I said, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, he calls it. He's pretty dramatic when he talks about a lot of those things, but defensiveness is a big one. Criticism is a big one. And contempt is a big one. And then stonewalling is a big one. So those four things, and you can see them, and most people, if they're experiencing them, know the experience, like know the feeling of them, but they don't know that they're going on a lot of times. Defensiveness typically is pretty easy to see because it's, I bring something up to my spouse or my significant other, right? My partner. I bring up an issue, and then they instead of listening and taking that in and either apologizing or trying to work through it, they become defensive and they basically throw it back on them, kind of thing. Criticism usually starts defensiveness, right? So criticism is kind of like this whole you language where you do this and you do this, and then when it starts to get super personal into your characteristics, into who you are, that's when contempt comes, because then you've got this simultaneous disrespect and real like dislike for that person. Stonewalling is exactly what it sounds like. It's the, I'm not talking anymore, I'm walking away, and I'm basically putting up an emotional block, and I'm not talking about this, and it's kind of a controlling behavior. And so when we think about those four things, those are really detrimental to working inside the principles that we know make marriage work or make relationships work. Those four issues really are detrimental to all kinds of relationships, not just romantic ones. They can be really detrimental with your kids. They can be detrimental in work. They can be detrimental with your friendships. And again, I'm hitting all these things real high level. I think I've talked a little bit about some of these things. This is one of my favorite. For those that, I mean, Tetris was like huge when I was coming out of high school. This is legit. Like putting things in a dishwasher you would think would be easy, but I have more couples that fight about things like dishes. I mean, in dishwashers and all kinds of stuff. And we've shown my kids how to put things in the dishwasher probably 25,000 times, and they, still don't quite get it. So it must be an art and a skill that you develop in your life over time. Okay. We're going to run out of time as usual, like we always do. I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of things. You guys will just bear with me for a second. I do want to talk about this, I think. Let me take a step back for a second. Does anybody have any, I kind of went over a lot of information there. Does anybody have any questions or anything about anything that we're talking about so far? Because now we're going to really jet forward into kind of that midlife and almost into older adulthood to a certain extent. Does anybody have any questions about anything we're talking about? All right. Okay. So here's what I want to do. We're going to do a group discussion for about 5 minutes. We're going to come back. I'm going to talk about the idea of intelligence and kind of give a super brief overview of intelligence formation across the lifespan into kind of the tip of older adulthood. We're going to talk about that. And then at the end, like kind of towards the tail end of that, I'll step back. We can ask questions. And at the very end, if we have any other questions about the class, we'll be able to ask them then. And I'll stick around as long as I need to. But I want to go back to a question that I posed way early in the slides about, hey, when does someone get into adulthood? Like, when does that actually happen? So what I want you guys to discuss is, and this is all either what you've read or what you think or what your experience is. It's probably maybe a combination of all those things. For you, when does someone become an adult? And I want you guys to talk about that. And especially if you come from like culturally speaking, like maybe a different cultural experience, keep that in mind too. That's important, right? It used to be easier maybe 150 years ago to know when someone was an adult. It can be a little bit more difficult now. There's no question about like legal age of adulthood. We kind of know that now. But when does someone actually become an adult? When does that actually happen? So I want you guys to talk about that. And like I said, this will be a 5 or 6 minute conversation. Then we'll come back and kind of finish. And I'm going to put you guys in the rooms that you were in before. There we go.
Did I lose you guys? Something changed?
Yeah, we're coming out of the groups.
Oh, okay. That was a quick 5 minutes.
That was fast. That was fast. You're just the first one out.
Well, it kind of kicked me out of the group.
So you say it kicked you out?
Yeah.
I'm glad it kicked me out because I'm in a car going to a dance recital, so I wasn't a good group member.
Oh, gotcha.
And I accidentally, have two because I accidentally opened it up on my laptop as well.
Well, you're getting double the fun.
Oh yeah.
All right. When you guys were talking about when you become an adult, did you base it on age or did you base it on something else? I'm just curious.
Personally, I based it on culture.
Culture, okay?
Yes. Yeah, that I shared with my classmates how really culture has a significant way of forming our way of thinking and our way of acting and reacting. And even I told them, and I have two sons, one is 18 and one is 16. And the other day I was talking with my parents, sharing with them my research, which is about adolescence. And we started talking, and my parents shared with me that my grandpa, in the age of 18, he was married my grandma who was 16, and they are already have a kid.
Yeah.
And grandpa used to take care of his parents who were at that time, they saw them older. And he was in charge of taking care of the whole family and farming the land and all those things. In the age of 18.
Right.
My son now, he's 18. He has part-time job in the Starbucks. And this is
he's not farming.
No, he's not. The only chore he has to take the trash out, and sometimes he forgets. So it's
and that's only 2 generations away.
Exactly. My grandpa, my parents, and I. So exactly, just 2 generations between my son and my grandpa.
So my grandmother, she died 2 years ago this fall. She lived to be 103. She went to 8th grade, and that's it. She was born in 1917, so went to school through 8th grade, and that was all. And then worked, all kinds of jobs. Got married. Had ended up having, she had 6 kids. One of them died when he was 15 months old, but ended up, there's 5 siblings. They're all still alive, with my mom being one. And so, to your point, Sarah, there is a large difference, generationally speaking, even between if you were born, let's say, in the late 1800s or early 1900s versus if you were born in the 2000s. There's a big difference in adulthood, even, or like a lot of the things that we're talking about, because basically your son would have been married and had a child and been working,
yes,
if it was the same.
And also, just to emphasize the cultural aspect, like until this moment, for example, in the Middle East, in the rural areas, like a man, or I see it as like a child, a man with 18 years old can marry a girl who's 16 years old.
Right.
And it exists until this moment. Yeah. And it's very normal, and it's also supported by the culture.
Right.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the cultural aspects of adulthood matter when we're talking about it. And we could get in, that's a whole other discussion, but I always find that a really fascinating discussion, because our world, like our overarching society, definitely looks at when someone's an adult or not. I mean, that's definitely something that comes up. And so
Doctor, we actually discussed that in our group, because 3 of the 4 of us are Hispanic. Okay. And so we were talking about how our family influenced a lot of whether we felt like we grew up or not. And so, or the growing up piece of it.
Right.
So, our culture of Hispanics, very, very family oriented, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So all of those things matter a lot. And if we were to go back 100 years, they matter mainly because you had to eat. So there's only certain ways that you could eat. You had to work. And so if you got lucky enough to go through high school, you definitely started working then, versus sometimes you didn't go that far. You just started working. Fast forward to now, it's a lot different. Our world's a lot different, right? Things are different, but developmentally, we haven't changed that much. Like how we develop individually, we haven't changed that much. Now I'm going to fast forward now and talk about this topic of intelligence. You'll build on this in other classes, like in the counseling assessment class that me and Dr. Armstrong teach. We talk a lot more specifically about like testing and assessing for intelligence. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview. The reason why I talk about this one is because developmentally speaking, like all the other areas of our brain development, intelligence, personality, emotions, cognitions, developmentally speaking, there's stages that they go through. They all kind of go through certain things at a certain time, and intelligence is one of them. And intelligence and personality are 2 of the concepts that they're not impossible to assess for, but there's some things that you have to think about when you're assessing for them. And so basically, when we think about intelligence, we break intelligence down into kind of two different categories. This idea of crystallized intelligence and then fluid intelligence. And those also have a developmental kind of cycle in our life. So when we think about crystallized intelligence, like as we accumulate information, as we gain verbal skill, though the crystallized intelligence is really skill-based, it's knowledge-based, and it's heavily influenced by culture, social standing or social environment, your educational experiences. And so when we talk about crystallized intelligence, it's kind of that whole area that we start accumulating skills, and it's influenced by those different things, right? And so it really starts to increase as we get older into childhood, and then shows an increase all the way into middle adulthood. So into your 50s, you're continuing to basically crystallize the things that you're taking in an intelligent way, right? Fluid intelligence is a little bit different because it's more biologically determined. That is more of your genetic disposition when it comes to parts of intelligence. So it's the ability to think abstractly. We talked about in adolescence, pretty much everyone adolescent-wise goes through this period of kind of thinking in the gray. That happens to pretty much everyone. When we start thinking about things like thinking abstractly about certain ideas, that's not necessarily bound by culture as much as it is by genetics, our fluid intelligence, right? So the way in which we're able to reason abstractly is really bound a little bit more by genetics than it is by culture or setting or society. So you have these two, then they kind of work together, but there's just a couple of different parts. As crystallized intelligence continues to build and increase into middle adulthood, fluid intelligence starts to decline in middle adulthood. Now, when I say decline, it's not like falls off the table. It's kind of just a plateau that it kind of does. And it could decline earlier than that, but for the most part, and I don't know if I've got this, I used to have, yeah. So this is kind of what it looks like graph-wise. I think this is in the book. So you can see they're both parts of intelligence are on a pretty steep climb coming out of infancy, childhood, early adulthood. That's when there starts to be a little bit of a bend in the curve. Okay. Whereas the crystallized intelligence kind of keeps going. Fluid intelligence kind of starts to curve off. And like I said, it's not like falling off the table, but a lot of that's because that black and white thinking is starting to really be cemented in your early adulthood. And the ability to think abstractly starts to change, not drop off. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means there starts to be some changes to it. That's all. The crystallized intelligence is actually kind of important because basically it's like, hey, we can still skill-wise keep building off of what we have, right? Like, in other words, that's not genetically bound necessarily, right? And you can test a lot of these things, for fluid intelligence, it's a lot of the memory span kind of testing. Spatial thinking is when we think about fluid intelligence, and that's really genetically bound more than anything. So like sometimes memory, memory is a whole different concept in and of itself. But when we think about crystallized intelligence, that's your verbal comprehension and social relations. So when you're testing for or assessing for intelligence, you're really assessing those areas in people's lives. So it's kind of interesting because these overarching concepts are just part of what intelligence would look like as we continue to grow and develop. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay.
Just Donna, she really made me laugh. Like she's sending that she's in that.
I'm sorry, doctor. We are having fun on the side. We're being,
I think
I'm
great.
being
Have
an
fun.
adolescent student right now because I saw your chart and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm on the curve down.
No, I think it's great. Man, y'all have fun. You guys stay awake somehow. This is
sorry, we'll mute.
No, you're fine. You're fine. It doesn't bother me. I've worked with teenagers long enough. I've watched people laugh off to the side. Who knows what? Someone could have said something random. It doesn't bother me. I think what people when people see graphs like this and they start to think about where they're at, and they see a downward something. I will say this. If you think about black and white thinking and abstract thought concepts, like thinking abstractly, let's say, if you're able to think abstractly and work to think abstractly more, it probably helps you in your life more, and it definitely helps you as a therapist more, because it helps you stay non-judgmental of other people's thoughts or beliefs. It's probably what I would say is the biggest area here. But think when we think about intellectual abilities, and these are just a few of them listed here, from 25 to 95. Basically, all of us start going down at some point when it comes to the levels of the different aspects of intelligence or intellectual abilities. So inductive reasoning, spatial orientation, perceptual speed, number recall, verbal comprehension, verbal memory. Verbal comprehension, as you can see, it kind of goes way out into the 70s. I mean, you're still kind of really hovering. In other words, you're able to continue to have a verbal comprehension pretty late into your life, and it's the one that probably stays around the longest. Versus perceptual speed, which makes sense. In other words, your perception of and spatial orientation of things coming at you. That's why as you get older, it's like, should you be driving a car when you're 85 years old? Or my grandmother was 97. When she was 97, she passed the driving test to keep her license, and we were all like, number one, why would someone pass her to keep her driving? So she drove the old school 1988 Cadillac DeVille, the real long boat car. She drove that thing everywhere, and I'm like, man, she's going to run over something, hit something, because spatially we just lose our ability to see things spatially. Like I turned 50 this year, and at night I'm like, what's going on at night? Why can I not see? I used to be able to see everything. Now it's hard. Well, that's because I'm getting older, and that's what happens in our life, right? And as we get older, we start to go through those physical, biological things that are happening, and it really does play a part in our emotional well-being and how we think about ourselves and how we think about life. Those things start to matter as we get older. Versus when we were younger, we don't think about that. Does that make sense? Like I used to get a book and I'd read it with almost no light. I'm like Abraham Lincoln, reading with the candle. I could read everything. And now if I had to do that, I'm like having to hold it back and look at it weird. You can't do that anymore. And as we get older, those are the things that happen. And we can either laugh about them, or we can get really pissed about them, or we can be confused about them. There's different ways that people handle it. And as a clinician, you'll hear all of those things. Right. The interesting thing to me will be, we're not going to have time to talk about, man, I'm always going to run out of time. I'm never going to have enough time. I've got all of these slides in Moodle. You guys can check them out. What I can't capture is all the great chats that are, y'all need to read the chats that are going on, because it's so great. So I really think that as we think about our development and think about the stages of development, I find working with clients, it helps me to visualize the person that's sitting in front of me, kind of where they're at in what stage, and that helps me understand a little bit more about what's going on for them. Because we can think about it cognitively and social emotionally and physically even, you know, when you start talking about working with people, let's say in their late 50s, early 60s, and they're kind of towards the tail end of their work life, let's say, and kind of emptiness into work life, that's a big transition for people. All of a sudden they're like, these things that were my identity for 25 years are all like, they're gone now. That's a big deal. That's a big transition. So if you kind of can visualize that for them, it also helps you have empathy for them. So like I said, I put these slides up. You guys can check them out. I always have too many. I think I always have too many slides. We're never going to get through everything. I don't know why I think we can, but I do. Okay, let's stop there. Anybody have any questions? And it could be about anything.
Okay, so Dr. Bedard, this is not about this class, but my question is,
I don't know. I'm not answering any questions about anything else.
Yeah, and I've just really enjoyed you. I mean, you know,
Great.
I think we've all kind of said, you know, all of us have lives going on and we're trying to fit this in, and you're just so cool and laid back and like, hey man, you know, I mean, it's not like, you know, get this, whatever, but what other classes do you teach at Amberton?
So it kind of depends on the quarter, but like in the summer, I'm teaching this class and then counseling assessment, but I always teach practicum 2. So practicum 2 is a class that as you finish your coursework and then you start into the practicum experience, you take a pre-practicum class, then a practicum 1 class where you're actually in a practicum, either LPC or LMFT, and then prac 2, when you get to me, you're basically it's like your last class basically, right? So you've done all the academics and you're finishing your practicum, and you come to me, and then I kick you out after that. So, and then I teach professional counseling. I teach, I think I'm going to teach advanced techniques and theories in the fall, I think, or in the winter. I can't remember.
Okay.
It just depends on, but everybody's great. I mean, I love all the instructors. They're all different styles, and you know, the great thing about our faculty is we all have experience too. That actually helps a lot.
Thank you.
I have a question that's related to that.
Okay.
So I kind of talked to my guidance, whatever they're called.
Yeah.
The guy that helps with the classes and stuff if I need it. But so I know a lot of people come from not just Garland. There's like people from different areas of Dallas and even Houston.
Yep.
Whenever it's higher advanced classes, I notice most of them thankfully have the ability to be held on Saturdays. But whenever it comes to practicums and you're shadowing someone, does that necessarily have to be in Garland? Is that something that you know, or?
So so there's 3 parts to this answer.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Until they change the kind of the structure and the boundaries around how many we can have in class in Frisco. Typically the practicums flip-flop each quarter. Like one quarter the practicum might be in Frisco, one quarter they might be in Garland.
Okay.
Whenever they release because right now we can only have 20 or under students in Frisco right now. I think that's going to change, but that's just been the CDC requirement during COVID, right?
Okay.
That's probably, but that'll change and that'll flip-flop back and forth. Second part is what we have been trying to do, and I think this will happen, but I'm not 100% sure that it will, is basically kind of have a hybrid type of class for practicums specifically. In other words, what we have been doing as practicum instructors is meeting the first 2 weeks in person and then being hybrid for like, week 3 through 8 and meet like 2 or 3 times Zoom.
Okay.
And then the last 2 weeks meet in person is typically what we've been doing. And I think that will continue whether we meet in Garland or Frisco, because we do have students all over. And like this time I have students in other states too. So it's not like,
Yeah.
so the third answer is if you came here pre-COVID, you just knew that you drove. So we had people drive up or fly here every week. But that's not the case now because we are in a different world. So I think what's going to happen is right now they've always been in Garland the last 2 years. Probably eventually they'll flip flop. Like by the time you guys get to that practicum experience, it's probably be a little different, I bet. Depending on I don't know how far along you guys are, but most people take this class are kind of at the early stages. So I think a lot of this will change. But I think that hybrid approach is probably, if I have anything to say about it, what I'll do is a hybrid approach where we'll meet on the bookends, right, in person, and then in between, we kind of do a hybrid. And what the Practicum 2 experience is right now is I've been teaching on private practice concepts and things like that. That's what we do as we get into Practicum, because we don't have time to do that in regular classes.
To further Cassidy's question regarding the practicums, does the pre-practicum and then 1 and 2 have to happen staged? You can't double anything, right? So in other words, you need 3 semesters that bam, 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 those are your last 3, and you don't, can you take other classes at that same time?
Nope.
Okay, so you
can't start pre-practicum until you finish all your coursework.
Okay, thank you.
And that's not an Amberton thing, that's a state requirement.
Okay, thank you.
What happens. Yep. Plus you don't want to take anything else. When you get to Practicum 1, you're seeing clients getting your hours to graduate. And most people are working too, right? So you want, you know what I mean? Like you don't want much extra stuff.
So with that, so I went the school counselor route, and I absolutely made like a graduation plan for myself.
Yeah.
And whenever I was doing it, I was kind of figuring out about work. How does that work? I'm assuming that most counselors, their availability are during the day, and that's unfortunately, I guess, when my schedule is like a 9 to 5 type of job.
So are you doing school counseling? Is what you're doing?
No, no, I'm just LPC, but
okay. Yeah, because schools counseling is a totally different path. So yes, what you're saying is correct. If you have a 9 to 5 job, then you will have to get really creative on how you get your hours. For sure.
Okay. So I was talking to my supervisor, and I was like, because I'm kind of over halfway. So
what do you do? What's your job?
I'm a case manager and a CDS worker for a class.
So probably you can figure out a way to count those hours, I'm assuming.
That's what I was thinking. Plus our office is right by an LPC, a couple of different counselors as well. So I mean, if not, I can always just hop over to the office next to us and be like, hey guys.
Yeah, what you do in pre-practicum is you find a site that you're going to work at, and you have to have a supervisor. And you basically sign a contract with them. You find all this out in pre-practicum. You guys will go through.
So it doesn't have to be someone that you shadow. They don't have to be in Dallas, because I'm in San Antonio.
Yeah, you don't shadow anyone. You're actually seeing people. Like you're working with
clients.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're actually working with clients.
Okay.
When you get to pre-practicum, you'll learn all of this information.
Yeah, but waiting till pre-practicum is almost too late to not start figuring out, right, where you're gonna be wanting to. At least I've heard that if you wait till then, you're kind of like behind. So
yeah, that's a great question. I can't speak to that super intelligently because I mean, I can tell you what I would do if it was me.
What would you do if it was you?
I would, if I knew, like, let's say I'm making all these dates up. Let's say that you're going to be pre-practicum next spring, let's say. It's not going to hurt you to start looking for a site based on the requirements. You can go into the LPC or LMFT handbook that's just been updated, and you look at all the requirements that you need, and you can kind of take notes over that, and then look for sites and supervision based on those requirements. And you can kind of start looking around and see. And also you can talk to other either alumni or other students that are maybe farther along, kind of talk to them and see what they're doing, because everyone kind of does it differently in terms of finding places. It's not necessarily too late if you get to pre-practicum and you haven't done it, because that 10 weeks is really for that too.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
You spend the first part of the pre-practicum writing a big paper over your experience and your model and things like that. And then the back part of that, you're really starting to find your site. And you would have already found a site by the time you get out of that class, because by the time that class ends, you can start seeing clients like right at the end of that. And so, but by the time you end pre-practicum till you end practicum 2 is when you gather hours. Even between the breaks and the quarters, you continue to gather hours.
Okay, so in your opinion, just for the like work transition, would you suggest going into more of a clinical, if you're doing LPC, a clinical setting? Since we are working with clients, I mean, that would be more to our advantage, wouldn't it?
I mean, it's really up to you. I mean, I don't, I think you kind of have to do whatever you have to do, right? If you're working, you kind of have to work around that. That's what I would say. The practicum is really to get experience, like get as broad as an experience as you can, but you also want to make sure where you're going, you're getting hours, because you have to have 100, face-to-face hours, and then 200 of the hour, you get 300 total, and 100 of that is face-to-face with a client or clients. And then 200 of that's administrative and supervision. And you get hours coming to class, like you get 40 hours in each class too. So it's not like, you typically, if you get the face-to-face, you get the other part too. If you're doing the LMFT track, it's a little bit different because you actually have 3 practicums to go through, because you have to get so many relational hours, and those are sometimes a little harder to get. So it kind of depends on the track that you're going through.
Okay.
I don't think it's bad for you guys to be thinking about this now or asking questions about it. I always tell people, read the handbook's got a ton of great information, and most people just don't read it. It's super helpful, and they've just redone the whole thing to make it more helpful. And so I would suggest reading through that and checking it out. And then you can start looking online at the I'll put this in the chat. Hang on a second. If anybody doesn't care about this, you guys are free to go. Y'all don't have to stay around. Don't feel the need to do that. This is the site that has, I'll put this in the chat, that has, it's called BHEC. They just changed this about 2 years ago. That'll have all the information if you want to be LPC, an LMFT, a psychologist, a social worker, or whatever. You can go on this site, and it gives all the requirements for licensure that you need for whatever path that you're taking. I've encouraged students to get on this site and check it out as early as you can, just to get familiar with it. Because when you get out of school, this is where you'll go to get your information, and this is where you'll go to get your license and to renew, and any updates and all news and all those things. You'll go here, which is really nice. They've put it on one place. You used to have to hunt and peck around for it all. Now it's in one spot, which is really helpful. So I would definitely check that out too. It just gives you good information. So if you're like me, I can never get too much information to help me understand what the heck's going on, so, because this is a new world. When you start talking about getting a license, you have certain regulatory things you have to think about and certain restrictions that you have because of that. So you kind of want to start wrapping your head around that. In other words, it's like We don't just graduate and they throw you a license and say good luck. It's not like the coaching world where you can just get a certification. You have certain things, certain hoops you have to jump through to be called a licensed professional counselor or a licensed marriage and family therapist. All right.
Just one question, Dr. Bedard. Are you teaching assessment in winter?
I don't know yet. I don't know yet.
Okay.
I won't find out until June probably.
Okay.
What's the, this is May. Yeah, sometime in June. I don't even know what, can y'all register? Y'all register for the,
Yes,
you
I
already registered for
registered.
summer, right? Summer's registration
Yes,
started in May.
I did, and I'm trying to build a plan
Mhm.
for the rest of the classes.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, because we have 17 classes, then I need to have, and like I am doing 2 classes a semester because I'm working full time too.
Right.
So, but because of the number 17, I was thinking of having 3 classes in winter, and this is something to share with you guys because we have 2 extra week, the Christmas holiday.
Yep.
So I was thinking maybe that will give me some extra time to take 3 classes. So because this is my first experience with you, doctor, and you are really amazing. Like you are so supportive and
Yeah.
like I am this type of person. Like I really like someone who's supportive and encouraging. So I was thinking to take assessment because in the syllabus it was you, and adding to it career counseling with Dr. Johnson, with Dr. Pamela Johnson, as well as the the marriage counseling.
Yep.
And in this case, I have I know you, I know your style, makes me feel comfortable. Also, Dr. Johnson, she's an amazing professor.
Yep.
And the only new experience it will be with marriage, which I have to take in person in Garland.
He's the best instructor at the university.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
So that class will be life-changing for you. It's a great class. You'll love it. So the people right now that teach, like Dr. Armstrong and I typically teach assessment, and Dr. Armstrong's, he's one of my favorite. I mean, he's great. You'll love him. We're fairly similar in style. Now I will say the assessment class has more assignments.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's more a little more rigorous than this one because of that. Not necessarily harder, just more. Dr. Johnson, she's great. I mean, they're all great. I like all of them. I mean, they're all great. Everybody has a different style and everyone does things a little bit differently. And so my typical structure is the same in terms of like, there will be an assignment, there'll be a midterm and a final, there'll be some kind of a paper or a project or something.
Okay.
So
If I could say something, Sarah, just so that you are aware, I've been taking 2 or 3 classes as well. So one of the things, like I love Dr. Armstrong. If I'm taking 3 classes, he will be one of my professors, because the reason being is that his due dates are way more flexible. So he has the syllabus with the due dates. Of course, you have to take your midterm and other exams at certain times, but he has the ability for his students to turn in things kind of at your own pace, as long as you get it in by a required time. But most of it, if someone wanted to, they could do it all at the end, which obviously you shouldn't do. But if you have to have a research paper due, like for this class, I'm working on the research paper, so I might not do my questions that he has for this particular week and instead do 2 next week. Kind of it allows you to balance that out a little bit more. And that's how I've taken a couple of classes from him now. So that's how he structures his, which is beneficial in that aspect, because you can focus more on on a different class if you need to, whereas that is always going to be there for you to go back to and you won't be penalized for.
Yeah, I think everyone does it differently. And what you get with Dr. Armstrong is like a mountain load of information of depending on the class.
Oh yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, depending on what the class is. With Dr. Pam Johnson, she's probably a little more strict and a little more structured in terms of when things are turned in. Same thing with Ken Johnson. And so we all just have different styles, but the idea is we cover the same, competencies and requirements. And so it probably just depends on, like, I think you're smart to think about, okay, I got 2 extra weeks. That might help me, I will say taking 3 classes is a lot.
A lot, but it's
Yeah.
just I don't want to leave one class
Yeah. No,
to
that
a
makes
whole
sense.
semester. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
expedite the process, but who knows, maybe I will just say, you know what, it's a lot to, but
Yeah.
this is the general idea I already planned, because technically I will be done with the classes next year, like this time, so I will start with the practicums by summer next year.
Yeah. So the other thing I would say is that there's a couple of classes like advanced psychopathology that are taught certain times. You want to think about that too. Like
Yeah.
some classes are taught
Yes,
teach every semester just because that's just how it is.
exactly. And I just found out that certain classes are not available through the 4 semesters.
Right.
And that's why I sat with my husband on May 1st and we did the registration for summer semester, and then we planned for the rest of the classes.
Yeah.
Just to make sure I won't wait a whole semester because the class wasn't available.
Yeah. And it's just a matter of availability of professors. That's all. I mean, that's just kind of how it works.
And another side thing, since we're talking about the classes, some of them require a prerequisite.
Right.
So, so that's why when I suggested that theories, methods, and counseling, if you're kind of planning out your stuff, that class is a prerequisite to 2 later down the road.
Yeah. I've always told people, like, if you haven't taken that research method, you need to take that pretty quick.
Yeah.
Because
But
it's
besides
also
that
helpful,
one,
but it's a prerequisite too.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm
And-
sorry, I didn't understand this point. So what is it?
Are you talking to me or are you talking to Doctor?
So when you
Both.
so when you look at your class that you can take in the syllabus,
Mhm.
some classes have prerequisites with them. In other words, you can't take this class unless you've already taken the other class
Oh,
before.
Yes,
So,
yes.
if that
That
makes
happened in ethics.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Which most of the prerequisite revolve around some type of research class.
Okay.
Most of them. Like in my assessment class, it really is helpful to have the research component because we do a lot of research in the class. So that's what's helpful about that.
What about ethics? If that's a prerequisite, have y'all taken it and do y'all recommend, and who is most similar to you, Dr. Bedard?
Oh, I don't know. The ethics
Oh.
class, I don't even know who teaches. I think it's Dr. Milliken maybe, or I'm not sure who teaches it.
Mrs. Carla Moffett teaches Ethic 1, and Dr. I believe Ken Johnson
Yeah, and he's great.
teaches the advanced ethic class. I haven't taken the advanced, but I took the ethic 1 with the Mrs. Carla Moffett.
But when you guys are looking at classes, do y'all think about the professor style, or are you thinking about the course? Like, what are y'all thinking about?
Course mostly just to because we have a guide,
Yeah.
kind of tier 1, tier 2, and it makes sense